Hello and welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. I'm Katie Tyler, and a familiar face, whether or not I don't know how you're looking at this. On my right hand side today is Duncan, Dr. Duncan Hall, obviously the lead in sociology and politics for Tutor to You, and we're going to be talking about revision today, more of as a discussion because, as you said, like obviously. Well, is anyone an expert on revision? I don't know. Probably there's experts out there on revision, but really just sort of throwing some ideas around revision and what it is
Yeah.
and what it can look like for our students and for the teachers of sociology as well. So my sort of first question to you is, as a non-expert of revision, as you were suggesting, what does it mean to you? What does revision mean to you?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Katie. Hello, by the way, and I think
Hello, sorry.
most people are listening on the podcast, aren't they? So I'm not a familiar face, although I do have a face for podcasting, I think. No, sorry. So in terms of revision, I think one of the I was thinking about it before coming on air, fortunately, because that's what we were going to talk about. And what I was thinking about was the various sort of advice that people have given me over the years about revision as a teacher. I mean, obviously, we can look back to sort of advice I got as a student as well. But as a teacher, in terms of sort of teaching revision or teaching students how to do revision, much of which was quite contradictory. I mean, I'm sure you'll have heard contradictory things about revision over the years as well, and how you kind of have to try and synthesize this somehow for something that works for you and for your students, despite the apparently contradictory nature of that advice. So, what I used to do was I used to teach, and I think I'd still do something a bit like this, try and get the content done. Yeah, I don't know when people will be listening to this exactly, but not too far in the future probably. Try and get through, sort of halfway through the spring term, to leave plenty of time for revision in inverted commas. And then
Are we
there's the
talking about
question
the year 13s? Is this
for
what we're
year
talking about?
13,
Yeah,
yeah, for year
yeah.
13s. And then it's like, well, what does that mean? Which obviously was your question. But then I also spoke to people who would say, well, why would you do that? That's just teaching the course twice. You ought to, they ought to learn it, and so they actually know it. It's in their long-term memory, rather than rushing through it and then going over it again. Why not make sure they know it first time? And I think there's apparently contradictory ideas. Actually, there is a synthesis there, which I think we discussed the other day a little bit when we were talking about flipped learning and things like that, which is that idea of, and I've heard loads of different terms for it, but like spiral learning or retrieval. There's all sorts of different aspects to it where, yes, they need to get it into their long-term memory and learn it, but you don't do that either by just learning it really well once or by just cramming it again at the end. You have to keep revisiting things and reinforcing things through the 2 years of A level, really. So in my long answer to the question, what is revision? I think it's reinforcing learning and ensuring that you do remember and can use and know how to use and where to use what you've learned through the course. So I think for a lot of students, it's reading through your notes at the end before the exam. And for a lot of us, it was probably that when we were at school or at, preparing for exams. But I think effective revision is something rather more than that, and it's something rather more long term than that. And so the question of when do you start revising, which I'm sorry if I've preempted.
I was about to say, I think you're my next question. You read my mind, Duncan.
Preempted a later question, but the kind of when do you start? Right from the get go. I think you revise after each lesson to a certain extent to try and make sense of what you've learnt during that lesson, and then also revisit at periodic times through the year. I mean, as we've said a lot, sociology is very synoptic. There's lots of connections between things and links between things, and these keep providing opportunities for revision throughout. Yeah, so you might start with, say, some basic theory. The idea that you wouldn't look at what is functionalism and what is Marxism again until 2 weeks before your exam, obviously you would. You do it throughout, and it makes sense there. But it actually makes sense for all of it, doesn't it? That you'd revisit it. You'd think, well, actually, what would they say about this, and how does that link with what I knew last week? So for me, revision is revisiting things that you've learnt in order to reinforce it, in order to use it better and make the most of it.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Okay,
yeah, no,
good.
good. It wasn't a right answer or a wrong answer. And like you said at the
No.
beginning, it's quite contradictory, isn't it? That, on one hand, there's this sort of idea of continuous revision throughout and content, but leaving the course, I suppose, right up to sort of the exam date as such to not really allow much in-class revision. But then the argument is you've done it throughout, or sort of do a bit of more a speedier approach with maybe limited and then doing the sort of the synoptic element and revision at the end. And there's a sort of merit, like I think you've sort of said, well, actually, let's get a happy ground between the both, if that's correct in what I'm hearing.
I think so, because I think when you revisit stuff, it does make more sense second time round, doesn't it? Once you see it in context, a lot of the stuff, suddenly you've got some context for it. When sociological theory, particularly, can seem very abstract to students at the start of year 12, especially if they've not done GCSE or anything. Suddenly there's all these new ideas and new concepts that make a lot more sense at the end of year 13. And so I think having some time at the end to revisit stuff is good. But what it shouldn't be, of course, is really that's when you learn it. And the kids have kind of soaked up some bits and bobs of it through the rest of the time, and then they're really going to learn it right at the end. You want to avoid that. But yeah, I think revisiting it at the end is good. Of course, there are good ways of doing it and probably less effective ways of doing it.
And that's what I'm going to come on to next, really. Is this, because you said, because you were saying, like, obviously, revisions should start relatively straight away, and then actually can be quite easy, can't it? As you mentioned, retrieval practice. We've just sort of short, quick win quizzes right at the beginning, and then obviously more complex revision as you go throughout the course. And obviously, it makes me think straight away of sort of the synopticity of it. The theory and methods theory question, particularly, needs almost everything to be taught in order to revise for that question. Although it might appear on the crime paper or the education paper, it's not asking you a theory question about crime or unnecessary education in isolation. It's everything and anything that you've learned,
absolutely,
anything contemporary. But then my second question, obviously, you've mentioned my actual second question, which is when should we start? So we're going to what was my third, but is your second question is. Okay, so what does that look like? You sort of said what, but what is the how?
Yeah. So what I always used to say to my students, and I think I would stand by it today, is that active revision is more effective. Now, every student's different, and I have known students that really benefited from just reading through their notes or, reading through stuff. And it can be effective. And so I don't want to sort of suggest that a kind of passive approach to revision never works. I think it does. But for the most part, students ought to be doing stuff with it for two reasons. One, it's, the kind of psychology of it, and I don't claim to be a psychologist, quite the opposite. But supposedly this helps in terms of how it stays in your memory if you've done something with it. But I think more importantly, you're going to have to do something with it in the exam. And I think remembering long lists of studies is fine, but it risks a list-like answers and list-like essays. You see them, don't you, where a student's done a lot of revision and they've remembered a lot of names and a lot of studies, but they haven't answered the question terribly well. And so the more revision is not just who said what, but how does this help us answer the question, or how can I use this to make a better answer to this question? I think the better. So that's my main reason for saying revision ought to be active. That said, there's a lot to be said for reading through notes, watching videos. You can watch all those Craig's YouTube videos on all the topics and stuff. it's great stuff. It's good pre-exam prep. But I think, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, sort of rewriting your notes and condensing them and stuff, and that can be good, and do it onto cards and things like that. It helps with embedding in the memory. But I think answering questions is a big one. Not necessarily writing full essays, although as much essay practice as possible is advisable. I would say, really, for students generally, they should just try and write every essay that's been asked at some point. Have a go.
Or even not planning it towards the end, I suppose. Once they've got those exam skills, you sort of, once they know how to sort of apply their sort of AO1, AO2, AO3, really, towards the end, it probably just be sort of
plans.
My method,
Yeah, and I was going to say that, So although I think there's a lot to be said for writing a lot of essays, because that's ultimately what they've got to do, planning the essays, working out what you'd put in the essay, how you'd answer it, is a big part of it as well. But it shouldn't just be what content would I put in it. It do need to go a bit beyond that, I think, to try and get away from the more list-like type responses, and have part of revision is practicing the skills as well as revising the content. Think, well, how do you analyze, how do you evaluate, how can you do that better? So that's what I do. Sorry, how would you do that? What would it look like?
Well, that's what I was saying, because you've mentioned
writing essays writing essays and planning essays is part of it. Got lots of things. I mean, if you think some of the activities we do, like for example at the Grade Booster workshops, something like Hook, Line and Thinker. That's one of our little games. I actually think that works very well. Or if that tends to be for a sort of 10 mark items questions. So you go through the item, can I find some hooks in that item? What sort of sociology does that make me think of? So that's not writing an answer. It's not even planning a full answer, but it's practicing a couple of skills, and it's accessing your memory. So I think find a load of items and just look for the hooks in them. That's the kind of 10 mark thing. But you can do a similar activity with any item, which is what sociology is in here. Mine the item for some treasure. So I think that's quite a fun activity. Obviously, our items are quite small on the AQA A level sociology, so there's never a huge amount in the item, but it's quite a nice quick task. Let's have a look at an item, unpack it. You can use real items, quick enough to write some fake ones as well. Could do the other way as well.
Quite a quick starter as well. I was saying students could write them as a starter or something like that, and then swap. So
absolutely, definitely. Students writing items in the style of is quite a good thing, because it gets them into the habit of what are these items going to look like. Definitely. So that's quite fun. So there's a practicing the skills thing, so that sort of thing. A to B, how do we get from A to B? What next? Break down a process, all that sort of thing. I think is very effective. In terms of revising content, you can't beat a good quiz, can you? Really, I love a quiz. But again, this can be something where you get the students to do, all the work. You obviously can set them quizzes, but they like quizzing each other, coming up with questions. If you get them to write get them into groups, each one write a round of 10 quiz questions on the particular topic you're revising. Obviously, you'll probably get a bit of overlap or whatever, but you can give them different areas to write the questions on to try and avoid that. And that's if you're thinking about revision lessons, that's a fun 20-30 minutes in a revision lesson, isn't it? Which is very effective. They've had to think about the content a lot to come up with the questions. Then they're testing each other on the questions, and from the teacher's perspective, you've not had to do an awful lot there, other than
so you did a bit of flip learning there. That's what I'm saying. Exactly
absolutely.
That's what it is. Getting those students, especially towards the end of their course, they should be able to sort of devise. I mean, I must admit that's one of my go-to favourites. So it's Friday afternoon. We all teach. Right, we don't have to write the RIT quiz. Actually, it's not about being lazy, but at the same time, it's about a bit of self-preservation on the teacher's part, getting them to devise the questions, the students, and then they self-assess them or peer assess them.
You could always write a round of 10 questions yourself as well, but that's a lot easier than doing the whole thing. And that's just if you happen to enjoy writing the questions, which some of us do. Absolutely. So that's good. Again, stuff that's quite good fun, I think, helps with revision, because revision can be boring, can't it? And I think
So why? Because I know that's what you're sort of saying. Yes, exam questions. This was one of my questions I was going to ask you. Is that obviously at the end of the day we are going to be assessed by an exam, and we both had a really good conversation with Dr. Caroline Oliver the other day about how degree courses are changing their assessment criteria. It really got me thinking about, okay, well, I can't change the assessment, that's out of my control.
Not the end
final exam. No.
No.
Actually, I was thinking, well, actually, wonder if we can incorporate some of those sort of. She was talking about using photography quite a lot in some of our revision techniques. Obviously, she wasn't saying that. I was just thinking, right, that sounds really fun. And also, that's how they're potentially assessing in some universities. Obviously, she's commenting on the University College London. I wonder how I could incorporate in my lessons without directing from the fact they are going to have to do a SAT essay exam, and actually something like photography. But the question I was then going to ask you, why do we need to make it fun, and at what cost to the fact that I'm not suggesting exams aren't fun and essays aren't fun, because actually I find them quite fun when I was a student. I found them quite cathartic, but I know that other students potentially won't do. So I suppose there's two questions in there.
Yeah, there are. Yeah. Okay, so if we take the first one, for me, it's not the exam and writing an essay that's potentially dull, although obviously it can be daunting and worrying, and actually that's a good reason for practicing it. So that's a sort of separate reason why you should do lots of exam practice and questions, is so that when you go into the actual exam, it's less scary, because this is just something you've done loads of times, and you know what you do. But going through notes, going over content again, practicing exam questions in class, or particularly like as a group, how would we answer this? It's quite an effective thing, like an essay walkthrough. But after a while, especially if you've decided, let's finish everything by March and do 2 months of this, students can start to think, well, I don't like sociology anymore. I used to like it when we were discussing discussing interesting issues about global development or media or whatever, value freedom, but I'm not really enjoying just going over stuff I already know and endless exam questions. So that's one reason. There's also the psychological reasons of what you remember, and you probably remember stuff that was fun more, just naturally. I think you do. And you make associations and you make links. So, for example, when we're doing our live streams, we do I do the word smash, which I love. And you can say on one hand, well, this is very low level thinking, really, because it's just to have a think about what this, it's just a key term, isn't it? Really, plus a fun quiz question which hasn't anything to do with sociology. But if one person remembers burger because of Justin Bieber, it's had an extra thing, hasn't it? That little link, that little hook, that little memory trick, if you like, does help. So if there's a bit of fun, it does stick in your memory, and something think about. Earth, Wind and Firestone or whatever. And you
just throwing them out. We're going to finish the podcast with lots of just word smashes. Any opportunity to shoehorn them in. Just to say, if any of the listeners to this haven't directed their students off to the Revision Blast, just to listen to Duncan and see his word smashes, then please do. There's a lot of them on YouTube, aren't there?
Yeah, and we'll be doing loads more this year, no doubt. Not just word smashes, but actually, if you think about all the things we do on those, it tends to be quick fire, quite good fun, and a mixture of sort of recall of facts and stuff that's a bit more demanding in terms of the other skills, and it uses some higher order thinking. And I think that mixture and that variety is very helpful in terms of making revision sessions effective. And it is, in the end, it's their effectiveness. Obviously, we want to make it fun, but it's not it's not edutainment. It's not about doing it because you secretly want to be a chat show, a quiz show host or whatever. But you might, but that's not the reason for it. The reason is obviously the students do remember that. The same reason that you wouldn't just do very dry lessons the rest of the time, that you try and have a mixture of activities and some that are more fun than just I don't know, read this section of the textbook, answer these questions or whatever. It's the same with revision. I think sometimes because of the proximity of the exam, there's a feeling they have to be very serious. It's like, oh well, the time for fun has passed. no more documentary Friday or whatever it is. But actually, maybe it's even more important at that point to make sure it's very effective and covers what you need to cover, but is actually engaging, so the students are absolutely on it rather than in a sort of fugue state. hearing words flying over them. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking even just about videos. I know we've done this before, where just even watching a clip, the students can apply the concepts within that. Yeah. So actually, you're looking at it slightly different from when you're looking at, say, in year 12 or year 13 as sort of a starter to a lesson or something like that to engage in debate. You're looking at it and presenting. You might use something you've used already, as a documentary, a short clip, and going, well, we've looked at this in education, or I don't think about Finnish schools or something like that. Yeah. And actually, we'll look at it again. Let's see what concepts you can link to this. What can you remember? So,
what's all the sociology you can link to this? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
And you mentioned photographs. You can do the same thing with photographs, images, whatever. And I think there's a lot to be said for keeping that sort of thing quite open. We have a tendency to narrow questions down to get us a desired response. So who's this, or what specific theory am I angling for here? But actually, if you sort of say, well, let your sociological imaginations run free for a bit. What sociology can you apply here? What's going on here? Then they'll probably come up with stuff that you didn't think of. But it really does get them thinking about sociology, gets them talking about it. Because in the end, the questions that they're asked tend not to be very specific, do they? I mean, some of the 10 markers and 4 and 6 markers, I guess, there is kind of a, the examiner probably has something fairly specific in mind. But you get some pretty generic, synoptic type essay questions that are bringing in quite a few areas. And the best answers probably are the ones that really kind of go for it, rather than thinking, well, I've revised this quite specific narrow bit of knowledge about this, so I'm going to write it. And you might, lots of people might write very similar essays of, highly revised content, and they'll do fine. They'll do well. But sometimes some of the best ones are the ones that perhaps surprise the reader. They're not quite what they're expecting, but they show really good insight, and a very clear understanding of sociology, beyond the sort of borders that we kind of set for it in the specification to a certain extent, and probably more in the textbooks and the teaching and things. Because I was thinking about that with a revision point of view, in terms of the spec. I was thinking particularly in terms of perhaps new teachers who perhaps are bringing their students up to exams for the first time. And I think one thing that can be quite hard is, because thinking AQA A-level sociology spec, one thing I like about it, as someone who's taught sociology for a long time, is the nice vagueness of it, and the fact that you've just got a handful of bullet points, and you can really sort of within that scope create an A-level sociology in your own image, in terms of in terms of the content you want to cover and the topics you want to sort of.
It brings me back to the spec point. Was it last year? Was what you revising? Crime deviance.
Yeah.
Crime deviance. but like you
The
said,
particular bit
it's
of
actually
crime and deviance we're
it's
looking at is crime and
from a
deviance.
deviance, yeah. But
Yeah.
actually, the scope for that
Yes.
is great. I mean, I think that sometimes my students are shocked on what I can shoehorn into a lesson.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're like,
So
"Have you done
yeah.
that?" Yeah.
So I love it for that reason, but I do think the sort of downside of that, but I think getting over this downside would lose something, so I kind of don't want them to. I don't want them to resolve this issue on one way. But the downside is, particularly for a new teacher, or if you're just doing a topic, change topics, and you're doing a topic you haven't done before, it's kind of thinking about, well, how much weight do you apply to that? And this, obviously, that's reflects what you teach through the year, but it also comes to revision as well. How much focus of your revision should be on that. So if we talked about that bullet point in the crime and deviance one, I think it's the first bullet point on stratification is enormous. Yeah, and you kind of assume that if something's got its own bullet point, then it's probably of a similar weight to everything else that has its own bullet point. But some of the things are relatively narrow compared with some of the other bits. So something like the first bullet point on stratification, which is basically all the theories of stratification and differentiation. I can't remember quite how they word it, but it's similar to the crime and deviance one. And obviously, what it is that first bullet point is the theory and the classic theories, and then it's that's filled in that broad sweep is filled in by the other bullet points. But I think you could think, oh well, I must have to teach an awful lot about life chances because it's the same as absolutely everything every sociologist has ever said about stratification. It's the same. it's
From the 1800s today.
Yeah, it's the same weight. And so therefore, I've found this study that talks about life chances for people with disabilities or whatever. We need to give that as much weight as we do Faber or whatever. And it's, I think that's difficult for students. It's difficult for teachers. And so I think that sort of side of it can be quite hard when you think about revision, both in terms of guiding the students. What do they need to revise and what do they need to focus on? What can they probably afford to not focus too much on? Because that sort of comes with experience, and you still sometimes get it wrong, don't you? I mean, I always caution against anyone trying to predict the questions, even with advanced information. Even with the advanced information, I wasn't keen on it. But under normal circumstances, I just say, anything on the spec could be asked on any franchise question. I can't remember the word. I'm wibbling now, but the any tariff question could be asked on anything that's on the spec. And obviously, you can kind of have a hunch that they're unlikely to ask a 30-mark question specifically on this or whatever. But they could.
But never say never. Yeah, never say
never. They could do. But at the same time, you probably can say to students, you don't necessarily need to know. I don't know. Say, I'm just thinking of off the top of my head. Maybe they're doing media. They don't need to know in detail all the 12 ways in which Barnes said that disabled people are stereotyped in the media in a study that he did in the 80s or whatever. They don't, knowing that there are stereotypes, and maybe we name one or two of them, and that if you remember the name of someone who did a study on it, great, is enough. Yeah, you're never going to, but I think that's quite hard for students because they've learnt that, so they ought to remember it, and it's quite hard for teachers sometimes to know, oh, well, it's okay to know that more generally, but you probably ought to know Merton in a bit more detail, and then that starts to get, well, which bits should you know in more detail and which shouldn't you? So I think that's a challenge for everyone that kind of comes with time, but everyone, it's and maybe you're using a few different textbooks, and some textbooks might have 3 lines on something that another textbook has 6 or 7 pages on it, and it's like, do they need to know the 3 lines or the 7 pages?
Yeah, and I suppose it goes to that thing. What is the sociology paper assessing, and actually, is it assessing just what you know, or is it really assessing how you analyse and apply, which is really
Yeah,
where the marks are coming from. Like, and they're not
it
looking for a
is.
list of every sociologist's names, and actually you don't
No,
need the sociologist's name. You don't, not that you
no.
don't need to know Sue Sharp. I don't know if Sue Sharp because it always sticks in my head. It's more what she says and how applicable that is,
Yeah,
rather than
yeah,
remembering a name and who a sample
yeah,
was, and every single detail around that.
yeah.
It's
Absolutely. And so I think that would be another point I'd make about revision, which is what should the focus of revision be? I mean, I've already said skills and things should be, at least up there with, so practicing skills, rehearsing skills should be at least up there with remembering content. But also, even when you're doing the content stuff, it should be about how to use it and how it's applied and making connections with things and how things link together. I don't see a lot of value in just, say, learning names and dates, for example, which some people might be tempted to do because they hear a lot of names and dates through the 2 years. And, there's what I always say, because people say, oh, do I need to know when Sue Sharp wrote Just Like a Girl or whatever? And there's a big part of me that thinks yes, you should. That goes against what I was just saying.
I suppose the historical context, isn't it? The historical context of the time, but not necessarily the year.
You should be able to contextualise things for the most part. But also, I guess when students used to ask me things like that, my own students, my response was always, well, if you do know it, that's good, isn't it? So it's never a bad thing to know something. I think knowledge is a good thing. So if you're able to learn, when Marx was writing or when Durkheim was writing, whatever, then that's
a question I asked you the other day, didn't I, Duncan? I didn't know the exact dates, and you just threw them off like some guru of sociology. I was like, 1800s, and you were there with your dates.
But it's good to know. It is good to know stuff, isn't it? But I think the key point is that is not what you're going to be assessed on. So in terms of where you would focus your revision,
exactly, you're not on Limitless where you've got to work out the exact date.
And therefore, if you are doing quizzes and getting students to do quizzes, really, unless you're just throwing in the odd one to be mean, it shouldn't be, what year did Marx write the Communist Manifesto, or who was, I don't know, who lived in wherever, or did, what nationality was Durkheim or whatever. We do a few of those on the Grey Boost, don't we? Just on that the eliminator type quiz, just to make sure we don't have to give all the prizes away. But, and as I say, it's never a bad thing to know stuff, but it isn't a general knowledge quiz. I think there are bits of the context of the sociologist. It is actually really useful to know. I think it is useful to know roughly when people were writing. When you do the theory and methods type stuff, when you do talk about values and things that impact on a researcher's choice of topic and research choice of method, if you can illustrate that with some facts about some particular researchers, so you could talk about Becker in the jazz clubs and things. Yeah, that's really good, isn't it? That makes for a richer answer. But you don't actually need to know, when Stan Cohen moved to the UK or whatever. It doesn't. It's quite interesting, but you don't need to know it to answer the sorts of questions you'd be asked in the A level. Sorry, I'm going on.
On a wealth of an encyclopedia of sociology. I'm conscious that we could end up speaking forever about
could,
this.
sorry, we could.
No, don't. Well, this is what you're here for, Duncan. This is why we rack your brains. Or brains, my multiple brain. My last question to you is, if we wanted to find out a little bit more about anything that we are offering, where can we direct people, just without sort of going into it too much, because obviously the main thing was talking to you about tips for revision, but where can people look if they're interested in the grade? Yeah.
Absolutely. So at Tutor to You, we have lots of stuff for other aspects, not just for revision, but in terms of stuff for revision, there's a mixture of stuff that you can get for free, and stuff that school might get or take you on, or that you could potentially, or that students could get. So there's sorry, I remembered I'm talking to teachers. I was like gone into talking to student mode there. Stuff that the school might get, or that you could point students towards. So and they all have different sort of aspects or different ways in which they might be useful. So the big thing is the grade booster workshops that we do, and obviously Katie, you come and do some of those.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm
Yeah,
excited.
and they're a great day out, and do a lot of what we've just been talking about. Really, focus on a mixture of, well, there's content, but also skills. Try to keep it fast paced, entertaining without just being edutainment. But that thing about engaging the students, using a mixture of visual and all sorts of different aspects of to engage the students and to engage different students. Lots of opportunities to get involved and that kind of thing. And we come around the country, and it's in a big cinema screen, and it's a good fun trip. We also have the online sort of companion to that, which everyone who comes to the cinema has access to, but also people can get access to separately if they, for a bit less, if they either don't live near one of our workshops or can't get out to it for whatever reason, they can access the online course. We also, for schools and for teachers, we've got these retrieval packs. I know you worked on, was it the education one? You
I
worked
did,
on?
yeah.
Yeah.
I actually, and also like there's a credit like to not the actual I can't remember the activities necessary, but the visual of it. It's very slick, and yeah, as an active sociology teacher, I use it as my starter activity, not just
Yeah.
the education one, the other ones as well.
No.
That'd be
Yeah.
weird if I just used my own one.
Yeah, and they're great for starter activities, aren't they? And I think they are aimed to be used throughout rather than just for revision lessons, but they're effectively what we were talking about, that sort of going back over some content, maybe what you've just done, but maybe looking back over something that you did a little while ago, to keep students reminded of what they've learned and practicing things that they've learned. And again, it's not just content, there's a mixture of skills and content there. We've got all Craig's videos, haven't we? And that collection keeps being added to, and that is content. That is. I mean, I think he's doing some sort of essay walkthrough type ones as well. Or he's going to, but what's there at the moment is the content, and I think that's a really good way of accessing the content. It's summed up nice and briefly. It's not too. Doesn't go into too much detail. Each video is sort of between 5 and 10 minutes long, I think, for the most part. So it's it's nice bite-size stuff. A lot of those have study notes associated with them on the website. So if you're just like going through something and you think, actually, I can't remember that particular concept, chances are if you Google it, Tutor2You will come up at the top of your Google search. So fantastic SEO or whatever it is. I can't remember the term, search engine optimization. I assume that's why it does, but it always tends to come up at the top of your Google search, and you can go down a little rabbit hole then. If you click on that, there'll probably be recommended or suggested other things down the side. There's lots and lots on there. We do also have, of course, flashcards and revision guides and various other things that students tend to get. So there is a lot there, and of course, as we've already mentioned, the live streams. I've mentioned that there are things that are free, and obviously the videos and the study notes are freely available, but also the live streams, which we've done quite a few this academic year already. I'm sure we'll start them up again soon. We might already have done so by the time you're listening to this, I'm not sure. And then in the build up to the exams, we'll do a lot of those. Like last year, the ones like just before the exams, thousands were watching those live. So that's a lively revision option as well. And obviously you can send your students in the direction of those. We also make the ones where it's sort of PowerPoint activities. We do make the PowerPoint available as well. So if you wanted to run through the the questions with your students, maybe edit some of them if you want to use different studies or different things, then that's an option as well. So there's lots and lots that
Yeah, there's lots,
we can help
the
with.
key thing is, it's not about, obviously we know cost of living crisis,
Yeah.
and see the cost of schooling. A lot of that's free. Do you know what I mean? And things we do pay, that are paid for are very reasonable. But a lot of that, you've mentioned is there's no cost to it as well. So lots available, lots of choices available to staff and to your students. So I've picked your brains lots. I probably feels like there's a sort of period of time now just before the sort of exams start. So we've got that sort of like, I don't know, window of opportunity to reflect as teachers what we're going to do next if we were teaching
Yeah,
year 13. So yeah, thank you.
absolutely. We are in that the revision zone, or we're getting into it, aren't we? So
We're getting into it.
hopefully there's
Yeah,
some ideas in there just to have a think about it, really.
yeah.
Sorry, I know we've gone on a long time, so I will stop. But I was just thinking, because
Is it a royal we, Duncan?
yeah, sorry, I've gone on a long time. Do apologise. But I was just thinking because we were saying earlier about getting the students to do a lot of it in the revision type sessions. The temptation is to just go through loads of questions on the board or whatever, and you can do a bit of that. It's fun, but getting the students to do stuff, I think there is a risk you can go too far the other way and basically make it free revision time, because obviously they'll have a revision timetable. There's stuff that they'll have time, hopefully, in certainly in the before the exams, where they can have a bit of time to revise what they want to revise and focus on what they want to focus on, and etc. But you are a resource, and so I would say you want to make sure that they're getting extra value from being in the lesson. Obviously, it's partly that they're with each other as well, and so that can be partly that they're revising collectively. But I think that sometimes, particularly getting nearer the exams, and you've perhaps done quite a few revision sessions, there's sort of temptation to just say, just revise what you like.
Well, I always see that as an opportunity to sort of see smaller groups. So if you've got quite a large
Absolutely.
classrooms,
Yeah.
if, for example, you've got them to, I don't know how different schools do it, but I get my students to rag rate, and if they're sort of at amber, get them to sort of tweak it, and the ones that are red that have signposted, or the students that are struggling with particular concepts or ideas, and that's a good time to see like those three students. I'm a big fan of the old Viva Voca as well. I'll just put that out there just before we sort of conclude. What I like doing is, so I've said it probably wrong, Viva Voce or whatever, I don't know, how to say it properly.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, it's my Essex accent. Do you know what I mean? Actually, I read an article about that from the Sutton Trust, and that accents are obviously it's not surprising, but it sort of impacts on social mobility. Basically, there's a hierarchy of accents. Anyhow, I digress. So the point is, I sometimes like seeing students one-to-one. I sort of do a little schedule for them, and I get them to sort of rag rate things they say they don't know, and then I give them opportunity for homework to revise it, and then I say to them, right, we're going to meet in a week's time, and I'm going to ask you a selection of questions around it, and then from that we'll write another list based on the stuff that you think you now need to revise, and sometimes just that one-to-one time is really powerful as well.
No, I agree, absolutely. Yeah.
So anyhow,
Fantastic.
that was my little bit. How was I supposed to say it, Duncan? What was I supposed to say?
I think that was fine. It was fine.
Is it Viva?
Yeah, no, I think you were right. I just misheard what you said. I didn't hear what you said.
When you have the supervision, the posh words.
Yes, no, I do know what you mean. Yeah,
I think it's supposed to be French or Italian. I don't know.
I had Latin, I think, but I
Latin. I don't.
Yeah. I had to do one for my PhD.
Yeah, I had to do one for my. I remember my one distinctly, but I won't go into it because it's not the forum to have it. But the discussion it's very memorable. Let's just say that.
Okay. That's intriguing, but I'll ask you about that next time I see you, Kate. All right.
You take care. Bye bye. Thank you.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye bye. Bye.